Dr. Seibert, if these three religions, which is called Abrahamic religions, and maybe I like to call them Adam's religions, if they are all from God, which one is truth? Is there should or must be one of them is true religion, or all of them could be or contribute to the way on the way of God, or something like this?
Yeah, that has been a long discussion, of course, and it's particularly Lessing. I went to a Lessing high school in Frankfurt, so Lessing is one of the great enlighteners, and he wrote the story of the three wings, and nobody knew anymore, which of these wings was the true one, and so on. And I think that is the Enlightenment position, that the question is, of course, what truth is meant. It's not a historical truth, if this or that has happened. It is not a physical truth, if the sun turns around the earth or vice versa. So it is a special religious truth, against the untruth of ideologies and so on, and earthly type of knowledge. So when Jesus says before Pilate, I have not, my people are not of this world, otherwise I would have an army and they would have freed me, my truth is another one than yours, the Roman Empire, and so on and so on. So it is some kind of a transcendent truth. It is the concern with the totally other than the horror and terror of nature and history. That is what the truth is, which one can then give names or images to, or one can deny this. And we said, that the Mosaic law does not want to make any images or notions of the absolute. And the great enlightener, Kant, has the same position. So here we see where religion and enlightenment can come together, which is so important for our culture wars, where you have people who say this about abortion, or other people say the opposite about abortion or homosexuality, where we have this war going on all the time, that we try to find ways to reconcile those positions. And there you have a reconciliation, the greatest enlightener on one side, with this human reason must not enter the realm of the thing in itself, God, freedom, and immortality, and then on the other side the Mosaic law, which says something very similar, So therefore the truth can maybe not be named, or one cannot make any images, so one can say it is the totally other than the finite and the phenomenal world. And so which of these religions is right? And I think they all agree about the transcendence of God, that God is not identical with nature in terms of pantheism or atheism or whatever. So they have all this in common, which is the same God. It's the same truth in a certain sense.
Judgment Day.
Yes, right. And they're all opposed to idolatry. That means to any kind of idols, that you cannot make nature or the leader or the nation or capital or whatever into an idol. So, and I think that the Holy Quran is more radical even than the New Testament may be, or the
it's always insist in Quran to say Muhammad is prophet,
Exactly.
So no one make him an idol later or something.
Exactly, yeah. So therefore I would say, that it is what the truth is not, is emphasized very much. The truth is not the nation, the truth is not this world, the truth is the totally other, the entirely other than nature and man's world and the horrible things which happen in them. And I think this truth they do have in common.
And this truth, maybe you think it's like, if we believe in God, this could lead them to heaven, to the kingdom of God?
Yes, all three of them.
Yeah.
Certainly, I think they, in Judaism, it is your own obedience to the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments, or let's talk in terms of conscience, the content of the Jewish conscience is Yahweh and his laws, and if you fulfill them, then what will happen? Your life here will be good. For a long time, Jewish people did not think about an eternal life. It was only 200 years with the Maccabees before Jesus, that when all these casualties against the Greeks and so on came up, when the resurrection of the flesh came up, which the Christians took over. So the resurrection of the flesh Paul says, if this is not true, the resurrection of the flesh of the Maccabees, then Jesus has not been resurrected. And then we who follow him are the poorest people on earth, because we get nothing out of this life and there is no other, So, but today, Jewish people, have that too. If you are decent, you follow the law, you repent your sins, when you violate the law, that brings you to heaven, which... See, the Jewish people, after the exile, did not even use the name God any longer.
Why is that?
Because of the second and the third commandment, right? It's a radical obedience to the second and the third commandment, not to name, not to imagine, not to think or whatever, the something, the other.
Absolutely.
Yeah, right. And so that is where people go there, your mother is with God, or so people would say, something like that. So, and you have it in Islam too, where you obey the law, you repent when you do something wrong, and then you hope that you will go into paradise,
And there is very interesting, I believe, verse in Quran said Christians said people know nothing.
Yeah.
And not people. Christians said Jews know nothing.
Yeah.
And Jews said Christian know nothing. And they both have the book. And everyone who don't know say like this. So basically, Quran say, if you don't know, say the other don't know.
Yeah.
Because everyone have a part of the truth.
Right. Yeah.
And everyone, based on his understanding, based on his environment, on his geographic location, he know what around him.
Yeah.
And this is good, should be a way to survive. For that, there's two verses again in Quran say Muslims, Jews, Christian, and the other religions were there also as believing God. They all they will be rewarded if they believe in God, do good, and believe in the justice there.
Yeah,
so this is like the three the three things will lead you to heaven or something.
Right.
Like
Yeah. I mean, nobody can say that they don't know anything. I mean, none of a religious person is not an agnostic. Of course, he knows something. People say, Hegel talks about the absolute spirit, for instance. And then they go to Auschwitz, look at the camp, and say, this happens when you know about the absolute spirit. But the rabbis who were in the camp, they also believed in the absolute as well. Yeah. So you cannot obey God, you cannot love God if you do not know him. So there is Jewish knowledge, there is Christian knowledge, there is Islamic knowledge.
But some people say, that come today, even Muslims say, even if the Christians believe in God or something, they will go to hell because their theology or their ideas is wrong. It's all wrong.
Yeah.
And we have it between all religion, I believe.
Yeah, right. Well, there one would have to be, in discourse, one would have to be careful to put other people into hell.
Exactly.
For instance, Catholicism has a very wise teaching in that they would say, let's say Cain, Cain there, our hero, our war hero, he has a cross around his neck, then he bombs Saigon, Hanoi rather, they didn't bomb it. Okay. So Hanoi, they killed 2 million people over there. So he's shot down, he comes down. Then you have the communists around there, they see the cross. Do you think they can see Christianity to that guy who has just bombed them to pieces and so on?
Sure.
So Catholicism teaches if you are psychologically or sociologically not able to see what the others do because of the horrible situation, it is through your religion, through your communism, you will go to heaven. So therefore, thanks be to God, Catholicism has really made some progress in that. And they even excommunicated the Jesuit who taught exactly that all the others go to hell, and that only if you were a Catholic you would go to heaven. So the church doesn't teach that anymore, and that is a very good thing. See, they can learn, they can change in the process, right?
I believe there is one verses in the New Testament. He say, "For God, there's many room," something like this.
Yeah.
So there's many ways, other way.
Exactly. Yeah. So see, Christianity is less optimistic than Judaism and Islam is. In a certain sense, it is a desperate type of religion. in the sense that the sinfulness of man, the original sin and the personal sins and so on, is so overwhelming. That means a sin is not only a sin against my wife or whatever, it's a sin against the Eternal One himself. And therefore it somehow needs an eternal atonement to overcome this. And therefore God alone, can liberate you. So it is not enough to do good works like President Carter, does all these wonderful works, and then you will go to heaven. But the good works, may have selfish reasons in it. They may not be so good as they look. And therefore, ultimately, it is only God who can redeem you,
Exactly. Only God can judge you.
Yeah, that's the exact opposite of Buddhism, by the way, which is a self-redemption type of a religion, That is very different.
Many Buddhist guys, they say we don't religion. Buddhism is not a religion. What do you think
they
about
say that because... Let's just go for a moment into the Gautama and the Buddha. He was a Hindu, of course, the upper class, and he was very protected, so he never faced the theodicy problem.
Sure. Yeah.
So he went down into the city once, and there he saw old men, a dead man, sick man, and so on. And he had this awakening, It's like so many people, they are not faced with the theodicy problem until it gets their cancer in their brain, and so on. Then suddenly it becomes an issue, So then he went back and he left his wife and his son and so on, and invented something, asceticism, you could say. That means he had the theodicy that all evil, first of all life is suffering, and this suffering comes from evil, and this evil comes from the what we call psychoanalytically today, the id, or the will to life, with the two components, the libidinous component and what is so strong with us, the aggressive component, the killer instinct. And so he invented the science of asceticism, how you could repress that will to life until you looked like Buddha, and smiled and looked at your navel and were very happy because you had overcome the will to life, and with it all this suffering, like this morning, the two journalists, butchered and so on, that you overcome the source of all suffering. So not like the West, you have one medicine for the ear, another one for the throat, and so on, but something which takes care of suffering universally, and it is totality. So that is a teaching of self-redemption.
Which is
and
nice.
In this case, he rejected the Trimurti, that means the Trinity of the Hindus, but they are at the same time preserved in what he calls nirvana. Nirvana, and the lotus flower and the way to it and the steps to it and so on, it's not nothingness in our modern sense of Nietzsche or whatever. Like the Greeks had meon, which was a good nothingness, and an ugon, which was a bad nothingness. Bad nothingness is when you have cancer and there's no hope, the other type of positive nothingness is when you have a birth, you have the pain, of giving birth to a child and so on, but something comes out of it, something good appears to it, and so on. So it is not that ugon, that bad type of nothingness, which the Gautama has, but it is rather the good one, the Greek meon, which is there. So it is something, it's not simply, that means the Trimurti is not abstractly negated by the Gautama, but concretely negated. That means he negates it, but he also preserves something. There is an absolute. Therefore, in that sense, the Buddha is not an atheist or without religion. It's definitely a religion. It's a religion of inwardness, where you abstract from all the outside things which stimulate your will to life and therefore stimulate suffering. And you abstract from all of it. You starve the id out, the will to life. And that was taken over in the West. Your Sufis there have problems because they took a pre-Islamic element into Islam. And we know why, because of the theology problem. And the same thing is with the Kabbalist in Judaism, and the same is Meister Eckhart and Jakob Böhme here. So they took elements like monasticism, mysticism, asceticism. They took that over. So you have Christian monks on the Mount Athos, for instance, in Greece, who let nothing female come up. No eggs, no milk, no cows, no women, nothing. When you go up with the elevator, So they free themselves from all the objects, the images which can feed on the will to life. So when we hang on television all day long, it feeds our aggressions, our libidinous side, and so on. We feed our id all the time through our ego and through our superego. And asceticism means that you live in celibacy, that you fast, a certain time, and so on. That means the ego gets in charge of the id, of the will to life, which is the source of all suffering and also the source of the theodicy problem.
There's a jumping question. I read in a book, and it was written in Arabic. There's a similarity between Buddha and Jesus. Like Buddha was son of God or something. It's not right?
Well, I mean, they are both religious people and religious geniuses, you could say.
But there is not in the story, like the mother of Buddha was similar to
No, I wouldn't say no. I mean, both were historical people, they are not just mythical people. They have been mystified a little bit, But underneath the images, there are historical persons. They have really lived, 400 years before Christ, and they belong to different classes. Jesus was the poorest class, and Gautama was the nobility, and Mohammed, was the bourgeois class, the middle class. So as a merchant, so they have different backgrounds and so on. But there are some similarities in that. To crucify the flesh, or what as Christians sometimes say, may come very close to the Gautama's teaching of asceticism, that you have to overcome the will to life, maybe live in celibacy. Jesus didn't make that a law, but he lived in celibacy, and Paul did. All the others were married, But it can come up, that if you are tempted to commit adultery, yesterday I found out that half of all married people commit adultery in this country.
Okay.
So if these temptations come up, or to steal and to be greedy and so on, then the Christian is supposed to crucify his flesh, which is very similar to what the Gautama does. As a matter of fact, he overdid it. He almost killed himself in the beginning. He stood on one leg and went to fire and hung himself on a tree, and he did all kinds of strange things until he became more moderate, and then found followers and so on. So there are dissimilarities. For Jesus, the redemption comes from the Father, maybe through him, but for the Gautama, it comes from our own efforts, our own willpower, and so there is a great difference, redemption by God or redemption by one's own efforts.
Okay, so there was one more question about religion. Do people like Christian people, when I say Christian, I mean Catholic, all of Christian, like through the history or right now, worship Mary, the mother of Jesus?
Well, that is a long story, the New Testament, and everything would have to go back to the New Testament. So if people do something which is not justified by the New Testament, then we have a problem in Christianity.
Okay.
So the Catholics made the Western Catholics, not the Orthodox, with whom Islamic people were very often concerned with.
Egypt,
They had still made two dogmas about Mary in recent times. One is the Immaculate Conception, that Mary was born without the original sin, and then the other one that she was assumed up into heaven and did not die a natural death, and so on. So, that is supposed to be justified by the New Testament, but the theologians are supposed to find something, but they haven't found anything. Okay. So you have the strange thing. Really, exegesis should be first and dogma second, but sometimes the Catholics turn it around and the dogma is first and then the exegesis comes. Then they tell, the theologians, you'll find it. They haven't found anything yet. So, but in the New Testament itself, Mary and the four brothers of Jesus and at least two sisters, they came and thought he was insane, His family was rather critical of him, when he changed water into wine, he said, woman, what do I have to do? What do I have to do with you? And so on. So it is rather real there in the New Testament. And then I think in the first 400 years there was not very much of it. I think in the 5th century or so, Mary Magdala was just discovered a few days ago in a synagogue in Magdala. They dug it out, and Mary of Magdala was coming into the foreground and competed with Mary, and so then the whole thing, Mary was lifted up higher and higher. And it can happen, in popular piety that Mary is better understood than Jesus, and she becomes more important than he, and Jesus is understood better than the Father in heaven, and so the whole thing gets a little bit deranged. And in this case, Mary can take, the place of the Artemis of Ephesus, for instance, full of testicles or breasts or whatever it is. She can take the place of the old gods, the Greeks and so on.
Okay.
It is up to the bishops then to watch, that this does not become heretical or turns into apostasies, that people go the wrong way.
I have a friend from Mexico. He told me
Yeah.
in Mexico we do it.
Right.
We worship Mary.
Football games, they may very well come to the point of worshipping, really, and then it would be absolutely wrong, because Christianity is monotheism, so like Judaism and like Christianity and so on. It is the issue of the differentiation in the absolute. So the Trinitarians emphasize the living God, and the living God, there must be movement in him. And so there is this idea, like John first chapter there, that God, objectivates himself in the Logos and remains one with him at the same time, and creates through the Logos nature and man, and remains one with himself, and the Logos becomes incarnated. That's the great difference between Christianity and the other two.
So is this justified by in the New Testament? Do you find this clear in the New Testament? There's
The
God.
Trinity?
Yeah.
Well, what is in the New Testament, but I think already in the Torah to some extent, that there is a God, and then there is a word, God creates through his word, the word, and so on, and there is a spirit floating and so on. But in the New Testament too, there is obviously, Jesus talks about the Spirit who will come when he dies, after he has died, and there is the sonship, and there is the Father, and so on. But it is not thought through, it is not systematized.
He never said, I believe, he never said like, I'm part of the God or another
Yeah, well, the only thing which he used was probably the Son of Man. And the rabbis, my friends, the rabbis, they say, well, he said it, I'm just a man. But it comes from Daniel. And in Daniel, it means the Son of Man means a little bit something different than normal man means. So I think Jesus called himself, as far as titles, using titles, he only used that, the Son of Man. And so, but the Messiah thing, he didn't want people to use the title sometimes, so that's true. So the Son of Man title is the only one he called himself. But nevertheless, the relationship between the Father and the Spirit and the Son.
Always he called himself like prophet in one of the...
He was called rabbi, which is teacher. He was called master, a teacher, and so on. So, but and he was sentenced by the Sanhedrin, the priestly government in Jerusalem, because of blasphemy, and they added high treason to it. So it seems that they took that as a rebellion when he marched into Jerusalem, and he had thrown the capitalists out of the temple, and so it looked like a rebellion, like an insurrection. So they sold the whole thing to the Roman governor as an insurrection, but internally they thought he did blasphemy. That means he put himself too close to Yahweh. That was their charge. And then also it looked as if he was overthrowing the priesthood or the priestly government. It was a theocracy. It could go that far, and then of course he challenged and he provoked the ruling class, the Jewish and the Roman ruling class, by his Sermon on the Mount, by his idea of justice, that this was injustice, how they treated the poor. He identified with the poor. He recommended communism as a precondition of the kingdom of God. The young rich man, he had to sell everything, he had all the commandments, he followed them. He had to do one more thing, to give up all his property and give it to the poor. And the early church had this community property. They had everything in common. but then it seemed not to have been practical, and then the monks, they rebelled against a church which became too secular, and then had obedience, and poverty and chastity, and so that goes through the centuries. The monks around here in Three Rivers, they're all communists, It's a funny thing when they fight against communism, and they are communists themselves.
So one more question. You once said believing in returning Messiah could be a part of a good life. Right?
That's how it is interpreted, It depends, we mentioned once that the antagonism between the religious and the secular penetrates the religious communities, and they split in themselves. So in Judaism, you have the Orthodox, you have the conservative, and you have the more liberals. They all have a different attitude toward modernity. That's how they differ. So the rabbi, who is Orthodox, he is really tradition, to hell with modernity. The conservative is a little bit more open, and the liberal is most open when he discusses homosexuality or whatever, It goes into their praxis too, if they assist the homosexual union or not, and so on. So the question is, which one do you ask that question then, right?
So why, let's talk about this thing. We have 3 types of Jews, let's say.
Yeah.
Right? But all of them depend on one book.
Yeah.
Right? How come from one book, from one source, we get 3 different point of view?
Well, it has something to do with, what do you do with book Leviticus? A man should not lay with a man as he does with a woman, death penalty, So, see, it becomes very concrete now. So the Orthodox rabbi will say, that is,
Clear.
Well, it says, Yahweh spoke to Moses. Yahweh spoke to Moses 500 times. Yahweh spoke to, which is amazing enough that after 14 billion years, the God who had never spoken suddenly speaks to Abraham, and then to Moses. So nevertheless, he has spoken, and therefore they think they have to stick to this, And I think secular people have to recognize they cannot simply overthrow this, or they have to prove that there is no God, or there is a God and has spoken. What is a God who has not spoken to the Jews and has spoken to whatever, But if you're an atheist, you have to roll that up, So you have to say, like Schopenhauer does, the Jews are liars. And Hitler repeated this, the Jews are liars, His whole teaching anti-Semitism was based on this, the Jews are liars, So, but you cannot simply start a discourse with somebody and say, you are a liar. I mean, that's the end of the discourse, right? So, therefore, when they say this sentence, has spoken by, when you are the conservative, he doesn't know how God has spoken, because God is not an organism. Okay. So he has no mouth, no tongue. So how can he speak, Well, there must be another way of communication. How did this happen in a vision or whatever, But each of these 3 groups will give somewhat different answers, and hopefully they will not kill themselves over this issue, right?
Okay.
But I always ask the rabbis, how they get to the truth in all these things. They have no teaching office like Catholicism has in the Roman system, But they have to get together, and it may take them centuries until they come to a certain resolution of the thing. And up to then, one may say this, the other one may say this.
So we have it in all religion,
to some extent, that's true, You have also groups, and I think in the Near East, who have different attitudes toward modernity, toward enlightenment, toward making images, and so on. And I think that is how the whole thing has to be thought through in order to get to peace, One says, this is our problem, What should we do about this problem, What is good in this modernity, which we should accept, and what is bad, which we have to reject.
Great. Thank you so much.
Okay, you're welcome.